Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we'll be having another sutta study session. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we can begin by going through the discourse. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. This morning we'll be looking at the Anattalakkhana Sutta. So since last time I spoke about the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is considered to be the first formal recorded discourse of the Buddha, it seemed proper to talk about the second formal recorded discourse of the Buddha, the Anattalakkhana Sutta. And again, this wasn't necessarily the second thing the Buddha ever said. So if you look at the story of the Buddha's early days in the Vinaya Pitaka, where we have the most detailed account of the early days of the Buddha after awakening. So we see that after the Buddha attained awakening and went back to the five ascetics, his former companions, he first taught in more informal ways, so just speaking a bit here and there and saying a few words of Dhamma and talking in more general ways. And none of that is actually recorded. So we actually don't know what any of that, what was said during those first few days. Then when the Buddha felt the time was right to give a deeper, more profound teaching, then he gave the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and that's what's recorded. Then again, after the Dhammacakka Sutta, he continued to have conversations with the five ascetics and give some teachings and talk about the Dhamma. And then when he felt the time was right to bring them deeper into their understanding, then he delivered the Anattalakkhana Sutta. So although we call it the second teaching of the Buddha, it's important to keep in mind that actually the Buddha gave many teachings in those early days, most of which were not recorded. But the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta was the first substantial discourse that was recorded, and the Anattalakkhana Sutta was the second substantial discourse that was recorded. So this discourse is found in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, which is the Khanda Vagga, the chapter on the five khandas, and Sutta number 59. So as I mentioned in the talk on the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the suttas are not arranged in chronological order. Rather, there's a somewhat less intuitive sorting schematic in place. And in the Samyutta Nikaya, suttas are sorted by topic. So the topic of the Khanda Vagga is the Khanda Samyutta. It's all about suttas which are focused on the five khandas, the five components of personal apparent personal existence. So the Anattalakkhana Sutta begins, Ekang samayang bhagava bara nasyang viharati isi patane megadaye. So on one occasion, the fortunate one, the Bhagava, was living at Varanasi, at Isipatana in the Deer Park. So the same place where he gave the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Tatrako Bhagava Panchavagye Bhikkhu Amantesi. So there the fortunate one addressed the group of five. And it's interesting here, it refers to them as the group of five bhikkhus. So they're already being considered Buddhist monks rather than non-Buddhist ascetics. So at this point, they're already quite solidly his disciples. They're the first Buddhist monks. So he says, Bhikkhuvoti, so monks. Paranteti te bhikkhu bhagavato pachasoso. The monks replied to the Buddha, yes, Venerable Sir. Bhagava Etadavocha, so the fortunate one said this. Rupang bhikkhave anatta. So he says, monks, rupa, so your physical form, is anatta. It's impersonal. It's not self. It's not who we are. So he says, rupang anatta. So the body, the physical body, physical form, is not who we are. It's impersonal. And he says, rupancha hidang bhikkhave atta abhavesa. So he says, if physical form was ourself, if physical form was who we really were, if this was our ultimate true nature, he says, nayadang rupang abadaya sangvateya. So then this body would not lead to affliction. So abada means an affliction, some unpleasant or painful or obstructive condition. And he says, labeta charupe, and one would be able to control one's form in this way. Evang me rupang hotu, so may my body be like this. Evang me rupang ma'ahositi, may my body not be like that. So here the Buddha is putting forth a form of logical analysis. He's saying, okay, first off, he starts with this statement. So the body is not who we are. The body is impersonal. It's not our true self. And he says, because if it was our true self, then it wouldn't cause affliction. It wouldn't be troublesome. It wouldn't be problematic. And we would be able to have control over it. So if this is who we really were, then we would be able to control it, and it wouldn't be painful or afflictive to us. And then the Buddha says, Yasmachiko bhikkhave rupang anatta. He says, but because the body is impersonal, because the body is not ourself, tasma rupang abadaya sangvati. Therefore, the body produces afflictions. It's obstructive. It's unpleasant. Nachalabati rupe evang me rupang hotu evang me rupang ma'ahositi. And one is not able to control the body. May it be like this, may it not be like that. So here the Buddha is using a form of logic which is, sometimes it's a little bit inaccessible at first glance. So he's saying, so our physical body, because it is unpleasant, uncomfortable, hard to control, produces afflictive and unpleasant conditions for us. Therefore, it can't possibly be our true self. And so the rebuttal which often comes up is, well, why can't we have a true self which is afflictive? Why can't we have a true self which is painful and out of control? Can't that be our true self? But what the Buddha is talking here, so he's pointing to this distinction. So between the ordinary things of the world, so the ordinary phenomena that we encounter, and which we don't consider to be me, to be mine, to be my who I really am. So our clothing, for example, clothing is clearly not me. It's just something that I'm using for the time being. So we don't expect much from clothing. But our mind, which is where we normally pin our sense of self. So in the mind, then it's like, well, okay, I can control my thoughts. I can produce the thoughts I want to produce. I can retreat into the safety of my own mind. At least this is what we think. The Buddha gets into dismantling that concept a bit later in the sutta. So we think, well, my true self, my ultimate self, must be that which is pleasant, which is satisfying, which is comfortable, which is a place of ease and joy. And the Buddha is saying, well, the body is clearly not that. The body is clearly not a place of ease and joy. It's subject to restriction. There's limits to what you can do with your body. It produces illness, it produces pain, it decays, it's subject to getting broken and damaged. So if this was our true self, then actually the body also comes in and out of existence. It's also subject to dying, disintegrating. So therefore it can't be our true self. It can't be the permanent eternal soul that we would look for or hope for. And what he's not directly saying here, but which is something which is spoken of in many other suttas, is also that the body is impermanent. And he gets into this later in the sutta. So the opening part here is focused on the afflictive and uncontrollable nature of the five khandhas. But in the second part of this sutta, the Buddha goes into impermanence. And usually that's where people have an easier grasp of the logic the Buddha is presenting. Well, I'll carry on with the first section, and then I'll talk about the relationship to impermanence. So next the Buddha says, Vedana anatta. So he's applying the same logic here. So first to physical form, to the body. And next is to Vedana. So Vedana refers to the experience of pleasure, pain, or neutral sensation. So pleasant sensation, sukha, painful sensation, dukkha, and neutral sensation, which is adukkama sukha, so neither painful nor pleasant. So all of our sensations can be categorized as one of these three, pleasant, painful, or neutral. And whenever we have any kind of sensory experience, sense contact of any sort, then we immediately classify it as one of these three, pleasant, painful, or neutral. So the Buddha says feeling, sensation, Vedana, also is not our true self. This also is something impersonal, not who we really are. And he applies the same logic. He says because feelings, sensations can be afflictive. We can have painful sensations. We can have disturbing and confusing sensations. We can have sensations which are uncomfortable and obstructive. Therefore, that can't be our true nature, can't be our true self. And of course, we can't control feeling. They come and go based upon sensory contact. So we can't be always experiencing pleasure, and we can't always avoid pain as much as we might want to. Then he applies the same thing to sanya. So sanya, the third khandha, the third component of personal existence. Sanya, it's often translated as perception, but I tend to prefer to translate it as identification or recognition. Sanya is the process through which we identify our sensory experiences. So again, when you have any kind of sensory experience, the first thing is to automatically label it as pleasant, painful, or neutral. The second thing is to identify what it is, to put a label on it. So for example, when you take a bite of some food, the first thing is, oh, this is pleasant. I like this. Then the second thing is identifying like, oh, this is crostata, or this is toast, or whatever. Or this is coffee. Like we identify what it is. So that's sanya. Sanya is the process of identifying things. And the word sanya is also related to memory, in that through our memories of past experiences, that gives us information which helps us to identify new experiences. So sanya. And the Buddha is saying sanya is also impersonal. It's also not our true self. And he applies, again, the same logic. Because sanya can cause affliction. It can be uncomfortable and painful, obstructive, disturbing. And also it's something which is not easy to control. So this also can't be our true self. And he applies the same logic to the fourth khandha, which is called sankhara. So the word sankhara has a few different major meanings in the sutta. So I won't go into the other meanings of it. But in this context, sankhara refers to thoughts, emotions, mental imagery, mental activities. So this is the coarse layer of thoughts and mental activities for the most part. So the process of Vedana and Sanya, this is more of a subtle, almost automatic, instinctual reaction to sensory experiences. Sankhara can be subtle, instinctual, reactive, but it can also be deliberate and volitional. So deliberately producing thoughts or deliberately engaging in mental activities. So mental activities, however, again, sometimes they're pleasant. So you have thoughts which are enjoyable and pleasant, emotions which are pleasant and enjoyable, but also can be afflictive. If you've ever seen someone who's caught in negative thought loops, you can see how they just keep producing painful thoughts over and over again. And it can be very challenging for them to find a way to break out of that pattern. Just repeatedly generating self-torturing mental activities. So it's something which is painful and obstructive and difficult to control. And actually, anyone who's practiced meditation for even a few seconds can usually relate to the out-of-control aspect of sankhara. So it's like, well, you just sit down and don't think anything. Like, well, okay, try, see what happens. See how difficult it is to keep the mind silent. Thoughts just keep appearing in the mind. And where are these thoughts coming from? I'm not producing them, so where are they coming from? So they're expressing the inevitable result of a past cause. That means I am not making them. I am not producing them. I am not controlling them. And yet, nonetheless, they keep appearing in the mind. So that means that can't be who we really are either. It's something which is out of our control. It's just a natural process unfolding in its own way. And the Buddha applies the same logic to consciousness, the last of the five khandhas. So consciousness is the awareness of a domain of experience. And in most places in the suttas, vijnana is defined as sensory awareness. So awareness of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, the six domains of consciousness, domains of vijnana, of awareness. In a few places it's defined elsewhere, but that's not relevant to the five khandhas, so I won't go into that at this time. In the context of the five khandhas, it's referring to sensory awareness, awareness of sensory domains. For example, eye consciousness is awareness of a visual world, awareness of the visual field. Ear consciousness is awareness of the auditory field, the field of sound and noise, and so on with each of the six senses. So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And the Buddha says, of course, also consciousness is afflictive. So what is the experience of awareness? Well, awareness is sometimes pleasant and sometimes unpleasant. It's sometimes enjoyable, but sometimes disturbing and uncomfortable. And similarly, it's something which is not easy to control. So sometimes sometimes we're unconscious, as in deep sleep. Consciousness shuts down entirely for a period of time. And even when it's present, sometimes it's sharp and clear, other times it's muddy and murky and hazy. And it shifts and changes based upon conditions. So for example, you might be prescribed a medicine which makes your mind blurry. So that's something which is not easy to control. It's something which seems to affect you despite wanting it to be otherwise. So consciousness also cannot be our true self. It's something which is impermanent and shifting and changing and uncomfortable and out of our control. So next, the Buddha applies a different approach. So he starts with a question. So he asks the monks, he says, "Tung king manyata bhikkhave," which means, what do you think, monks? What's your concept about this? What do you think? Rupang nichang va anichang va. So rupang, physical form, the body. Is it nicca, which means permanent, stable, solid? Or is it anicca, impermanent, unstable, insubstantial, constantly changing? And the monks reply, anichang Bhante. So it's impermanent. It's subject to change. It's unstable, insubstantial, not solid. And so you look at your own physical experience and you can confirm this for yourself. The body is constantly changing. It's not solid or stable. There's nothing of permanent persistence here. And the Buddha then says, he says, Yampanani chang, so is that which is impermanent, dukkang vatang sukhang va. So is it dukkha or is it sukha? Is it unsatisfying, dukkha, or is it satisfying, sukha? In other words, if something is impermanent and subject to change, does that make it unsatisfying or satisfying? And the monks reply, dukkang Bhante. So because the body is impermanent and constantly changing, then it's unsatisfying. And what makes it unsatisfying is actually our desire and attachment in relationship to the body. So when our body feels pleasant, then we want it to stay that way. When our body is healthy and strong, we want it to stay that way. When our body feels good, we want it to stay that way. But the nature of the body is to change, constantly shifting and changing. So that means the pleasant conditions are not reliable. They're subject to dissipating and altering. So we can't depend upon the body for happiness. So that's why the monks say, yeah, it's dukkha. It's unsatisfying. And the Buddha says, Yam panane chang dukkang viparinama dhammang. So that which is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. Now, so viparinama dhamma means subject to change, but viparinama means more than just change in an ordinary sense. It means like a catastrophic change, disastrous change, change for the worse. For example, elsewhere in the suttas, the term viparinama is commonly used to refer to serious illnesses and death. So like, oh, there's been a viparinama in my relative would mean like there's something really awful has happened. It's not just change in the sense of like, oh, they dyed their hair blonde. No, it's a disaster, like they've got brain cancer or they're dying. That's what we mean by viparinama. So the Buddha says, so yampanani chang dukkang viparinama dhammang. So that which is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to catastrophic change. He says, kalang nutang samanupasitong. Is it appropriate to regard it as etang mama, this is mine, eso hamasmi, I am this, eso me atta, this is myself? And the monks reply, no he tang Bhante, which means certainly not. So no he tang is, so no means no, and he means certainly, and e tang means that. So no he tang literally means certainly not that, or definitely not that. So our true self, if the body was our true self, then it wouldn't be impermanent, it wouldn't be unsatisfying, and it wouldn't be subject to catastrophic change, disastrous, painful circumstances. So it's not, doesn't make sense to consider it me, but it doesn't even make sense to consider it mine. So saying this belongs to me, well, can you control your own possessions? In one of the suttas, the Buddha's talking to a king, and the Buddha says like, well, within your kingdom, do you have the power to tell people what to do, the power to distribute wealth, the power to arrest criminals, and so on? And the king says, yeah, of course, it's my kingdom. And the Buddha's like, well, what about somebody else's kingdom? Like, well, no, of course you can't control somebody else's kingdom. You can only control your own. And so then you can't even control your own body. So your own body is like somebody else's kingdom. It's something which is not subject to your control. It's something which you're not capable of exerting authority over. So how can you consider it to belong to you? How can you say this is mine, let alone say this is who I am, this is my true self? So then the Buddha, he applies the same logic to each of the other four khandhas as well. So he says, what do you think? Is feeling, Vedana, is Vedana permanent or impermanent? And also sanya, sankhara, and vijnana. So all 5 khandhas. And each time the monks reply, that's impermanent. And Buddha says is something that is impermanent. Is it unsatisfying or satisfying? And they reply, it's unsatisfying, Bhante. It's dukkha. And if something is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to catastrophic change, is it proper to say, this is mine, this is who I am, this is my true self? And of course they say, no, Bhante, definitely not. So then the Buddha summarizes. He says, Tasmati habikave. He says, therefore, monks, yang kinchi rupam. So he says, any form, any physical form, any body whatsoever. Atitana gata pannang. So this means past, future, or present. Atita, past. Anagata, future. Pachupanna, present. Ajatang va behidava. So internal or external. O larikang va sukumang va. So coarse or subtle. Hinang va panitang va. Inferior or superior. Yangdure santikeva. So something that's far away or close by. Sabbang rupang, so all physical form, all bodies. Netang mama, neso hamasmi, nameso atati, eva metang yatabu tang samapanyaya dattabang. So it should be seen as it is with right wisdom. This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. And the Buddha says the same statement about Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, and Vijnana. So each of them should be seen in the same way. So whether it's past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, near or far, all form, feeling, identification, thought, and consciousness, all of it should be seen in the same way as this is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. And the Buddha again, he then says, "Evang pasang bhikkhave." So when one sees in this way, suttava arya savako. So suttava means one who has heard, one who has learned. So suttava arya savako. So Arya Savaka, Arya means noble, the noble ones, and Savaka means disciple. So Arya Savaka is the disciple of the noble ones. Arya Savaka is often translated as noble disciple, but I'm of the opinion that the meaning is disciple of the noble ones. And this is because the term Arya Savaka is used in many circumstances where it doesn't appear to be referring to an awakened being, but rather to someone who is not yet awakened, but is learning from those who are. So Arya Savaka is a disciple of the noble ones. So Suttama Arya Savaka means a disciple of the noble ones who has heard the Dhamma, who has learned the Dhamma. So Evang Pasang Bhikkhave Suttama Arya Savako. So seeing thus, or seeing in this way, monks, the learned disciple of the noble ones, Rupasming pinibindati, becomes disenchanted with the body. Vedanaya pinibindati, becomes disenchanted with feeling, sanya, sankhara, and vijnana. And nibindati is an interesting word. So we translated it as disenchantment, so becoming disenchanted. So what it comes from is from the verb vindati, which means to seek, to look for, to try to find something. And the prefix ner, which means down. So nibindati means you've put down the search. You're no longer searching for, you're no longer looking for happiness where it can't be found, which is in the body. So the impermanent, unsatisfying, uncontrollable body. In feelings, which again are impermanent, unsatisfying, and uncontrollable. In perception, memory, identification, what we call sanya. In sankhara, so thoughts, mental activities, emotions, and so on. And not even in consciousness. So consciousness is also just a sankhara. It's just a conditional formation, something which is impermanent and subject to change, just like everything else, and subject to affliction, like everything else. So, and then the Buddha makes this very simple 4-word statement, it's actually one of my favorite statements in the entire Sutta Pitaka. And the Buddha says this in many, many different suttas. But it's a very beautiful summary of Buddhist practice. The Buddha says, Nibbindang virajati, viraga vimujjati. So nibbindang virajati means disenchantment causes dispassion. Viraga vimujjati, dispassion causes liberation. So disenchantment, so when we stop seeking for happiness in the 5 khandhas, then the mind becomes dispassionate. So our lust, our passion, our craving fades away. So through cultivating contentment, then our craving dissipates. And viraga vimucchati, dispassion causes liberation. So when the mind is free of passion, then it drops all of its defilements and delusions. It sees things clearly as they are. So the Buddha says, Vimuttasming vimuttamiti jnanang hoti. So when it is liberated, then one knows that it's liberated. This is another extremely important statement that the Buddha makes. So when one attains liberation, one immediately knows without the slightest doubt that one has attained liberation. I remember many, many years ago, I was reading a book about a particular teacher who started off Buddhist, but eventually wandered off into his own ideas and basically created his own spiritual tradition. Anyway, so in this book, he says that he had this far out spiritual experience one day, but he didn't really know what it was. And then 6 months later, he was reflecting back on it and he was like, oh, I think I attained enlightenment on that day. That was the day that I attained full awakening. But actually, according to the Buddha, if it had actually been full awakening, he would have known immediately. Without the slightest hesitation or doubt, he would have instantly known that it was full liberation, full awakening. It wouldn't have taken 6 months to figure out what had happened. He would have known immediately. So vimuttasming vimuttamiti jnanam hoti. So when one is liberated, one knows that one is liberated immediately, without any interval. And then next he gives one of the standard statements of a newly awakened being, kina jati, which means birth is eliminated. So one will no longer be subject to rebirth and samsara. Vusitang brahmacharyang, this means the spiritual life has been lived, it's been completed, it's been fulfilled. Katang karaniyang, what was to be done has been done. In other words, there's nothing more that one needs to do. One has completely purified the mind, which means there's nothing left in all the universe. There's nothing left which you need to do. Naparang atataya means there will not be another existence here. One will not continue in this state of being. Again, the statement that one is no longer stuck in samsara, one is no longer cycling through birth and death. And the sutta concludes, Idamavocha Bhagava, this is what the Blessed One said, the Fortunate One said, Attamana Panchavagya Bhikkhu Bhagavato Basitang Abhinando. And so satisfied, the group of 5 monks delighted in the Fortunate One's speech. Imasminch Panaveya Karanasming Banyamane. Furthermore, while this explanation was being spoken, Panchavagyanang Bhikkhunang Anupadaya Asavehi Chittani Vimuchingsu. So the minds of the 5 bhikkhus was liberated from the influences, the subconscious influences, asavas. So asava are the harmful underlying habits of mind, the harmful influences in the mind. And so it says that their minds were liberated from the asavas, the underlying afflictive tendencies, through non-clinging. Anupadaya means through non-clinging, through letting go. So this sutta is significant because this was the time when the first people other than the Buddha attained full awakening. So at the end of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Kondanya attained stream entry, the first stage of awakening, but he was still not yet fully awakened. But with the Anattalakkhana Sutta, then all 5 of the group of 5 monks attained full awakening. So this sutta emphasizes impermanence and non-self, which were hinted at in the Dhammacakka Sutta, but not explained in any detail. But this sutta was the first time that the Buddha gave a clear description of how recognizing the impermanent and unsatisfying nature of our experience can naturally lead to a recognition of not-self, a deep experience of the impersonal nature of phenomena. So that's the end of the sutta. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And at this time, I can take any questions that you might have. So hello to all the people joining in. So hello to Gita, Yankee, Miguel, Sujon, Sud, Morgana, Jayanta, Smiley, Vivian, Pratik, Hui, Olga, Ronald, Galaxy. Hello to all of you. And I see there is one question here. Sud says, even though the body is not self, events associated with it cause physical suffering. In metta, we want to not suffer, to be happy. How do you reconcile seeing the body as not I with metta? Well, there's no conflict here. So in fact, it's not the body itself that causes suffering, but rather it's the desire and attachment in relation to the body that causes suffering. So the 5 khandhas themselves are not inherently suffering, but rather it's our distorted relationship with the 5 khandhas that causes suffering. So in metta, yeah, we want everyone to be free of suffering. We want everyone to be truly happy. And that also necessarily means that we want them to cultivate wisdom. We want them to cultivate the wisdom which sees the impermanent and impersonal nature of things, so that they'll let go of the cause of their suffering. So the cause of suffering is desire and grasping. So wishing for everyone to be happy means also wishing for them to let go of the causes of their unhappiness. Yeah, so there's no conflict here with metta. In fact, the pinnacle of metta is the cultivation of wisdom, because wisdom is the path to true happiness. And I don't see any other questions online. Here's one. So this person asks, once you become enlightened, does your karma not affect your birth and death? Do you escape the cycle regardless? So if by enlightened you mean full awakening, so becoming an arhat or Pacceka Buddha or Sammasambuddha, then you are no longer subject to birth and death. So you will not be reborn again in samsara. In that sense, any residual karma that you have from the past will not affect birth and death, because you won't have any more birth and death. So yeah, you've escaped the cycle of samsara at that point. I should point out, by the way, that the word enlightenment or enlightened is sometimes it's used as a translation for, especially in the Chinese tradition, they use it as a translation for a word which more means a moment of realization. So the word enlightenment is sometimes used, especially in the Mahayana traditions, not to mean full awakening, but rather to mean a moment of insight. So it's important to make that distinction. When we say enlightenment, are we talking about complete full awakening? Or are we talking about a moment of insight, which might be shallow or it might be deep, but it's just a moment. So if you mean, again, if by enlightened you mean complete full awakening, as an Arhat or Pacceka Buddha or Sammasambuddha, then yes, that's freedom from the cycle of birth and death. But if by enlightenment you just mean a moment of seeing deeply into the Dhamma, then no, that doesn't necessarily break you free of the cycle. So that's the last question from online. Are there any questions from here? No? So if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and end at this time. So we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.